Good evening, folks. We're so glad you're here. This is the first ever Bishop Hill virtual Chautauqua. And we're so excited to have six simply amazing performers. Well, at least four of them are amazing, and one's pretty good. Um, and we are here in large part in great gratitude to our sponsors. I want to start by thanking the Bishop Hill Heritage Association and Todd DeDecker, who works with me to create this wonderful event. Um, the American Scandinavian Foundation, who has helped to sponsor not just some of the individual speakers, but at least two of these programs. They sponsored the research and development of the show. The first show you're going to actually both shows tonight, I believe, both Jonas Olson and Joe Hill were sponsored by the American Scandinavian Foundation. And of course, Barbara Osher Pro Suiza Foundation has been a big supporter of Bishop Hill overall, but especially the Chautauqua the past few years. And of course, the Illinois Arts Council, we're all big fans. Write your state Congress people and let them know to support the arts. There's actually some money sitting in a pie waiting for the Illinois Arts Council to disperse it, waiting for the state legislature. And of course, we have the Bill and Susan Sherrard Foundation, SWIA Chicago, and the Twin Flower Inn Bed and Breakfast as our sponsors. Our first program this evening is somebody you might recognize here in a couple of minutes. Uh, One of the founders of Bishop Hill. Now, everyone talks about Eric Janssen or Eric Janssen, and Eric Janssen was the charismatic leader. He was the one who created a movement, the Jansenist. But even before he came on board, Jonas Olson was a leader in the devotionalist movement. And it was Jonas Olson who helped to give Eric Janssen a leg up. It was Jonas Olson's brother, Olaf, who came to America first to scout out territory. And then when Eric met his demise, it was Jonas Olson who helped to take the reins and create um, the theocracy to manage some of the best years financially for Bishop Hill. So let's go ahead and get started. Um, and in just a couple of minutes, you're going to meet one of my favorite characters, one of the founders of Bishop Hill, Jonas Olson. But then stick around because Joe Hill will be coming up afterwards. Again, if you have any questions, type them in the chat, and we'll be looking for those soon. Thank you. And please, yes, take a moment and share this on Facebook, share the post, share the link from the History in Person YouTube channel. Let's see if we can get some of your friends on board as well. Uh, Looking forward to meeting Jonas Olson.
Har gott gott vara, och vad livet dakar hund, humlen sulum fören frala, har gott vara. It is wonderful to be living. Life is marvelous to behold. Flocks of birds are gleefully singing. Grass is growing green and bold. Hear the bumblebees buzzing. See the butterfly in flight. Out of nectar-filled little petals, flowers toast us to our delight. It is wonderful to be living here in Bishop Hill. The grass is growing green and bold, so the cows produce the best cream. And the dairy maids are happy, no? My name is Jonas Olson, and it is a great honor to be here at the semi-demi-septicentennial. It was the 50th anniversary that I last delivered this speech on the history of the founding of this town, Bishop Hill. I will speak to you of our voyages from Sweden, the origins of the devotionalist movement, our building of this great city. Though I know that some of you just want to hear about the murder. the murder of Eric Jansen, and I will tell you about the murder. But first, please, allow me to share with you our fondest memories. I was born in Sweden in 1809, the same year that Abraham Lincoln was born. And my father was a farmer, but my father was a drunk. As a boy, I fled home and I moved to Stockholm for a short while. I would fish in Soderala. I would harvest salmon from the Baltic. And then I would bring them to Stockholm to sell. And I soon learned that if I smoked the fish first, I could sell it at a better price. And I did well. It was there in Stockholm that I met George Scott, who was the first Swedish Methodist, an industrialist who built a plant, and he brought a Swedish Methodist with him from England to help us to learn more about Methodism. My father passed. There's no doubt that alcohol had much to do with his early demise. And so I was called home to take over the family farm. It was about this time that the Lazar, the readers, the devotionalist movement began to grow. You might have trouble understanding this, but if you were living in Sweden when I was, that you must attend the Lutheran church. You could be fined or imprisoned if you did not tithe the church, like a tax. The church and the state were very much together, and it was forbidden to read the Bible and think for yourself. You must be careful with people who think for themselves. But we would meet in our homes because Martin Luther had translated the Bible into German. And the Gutenberg press meant that it could be printed. And eventually was translated into Swedish. And so we were called the readers. And at first the church looked the other way. We preferred devotionalist because we came to church. We willingly paid our tithe. We attended in good numbers. And the church ignored the fact that we would meet and we would read and we would discuss the meaning of the most holy word for ourselves. But then a young man was traveling the countryside. I'll never forget the first time that I met Eric Jansen. He was known as the Wheat Flour Messiah. And he came to Hälsingland, where I lived, because he knew that the devotionalist movement was strong. And he arrived on a Saturday night, and of course I welcomed him to stay in my home. We said a prayer before dinner, and we went to church the next morning. And after church, my sister asked to purchase some wheat flour, and he scolds her, his host. He said, "This is the Lord's day, and I shall not do business on this day. Ask me tomorrow, and you will get what you want." Well, that evening, again at supper, we gathered, we prayed, and we feasted. And after supper, he scolds me. He says, "You are the head of this household. Why do you not call your family to prayer morning, noon, and night?" The word stung. But he was right. It was my responsibility to make sure that my family, we worshiped the Lord and sang the praises morning, noon, and night. My mother encouraged me, and my first wife. But she passed in childbirth. Later, getting ahead of myself just a little, I married Karen Wexel, and we had 2 daughters, and I understand that they still live here in Bishop Hill. You know the Wexels. But that is not the story I meant to tell. I was enamored with Eric, for he traveled broadly, selling wheat flour. He was allowed to travel. And when it was at first 5 or 10 or 15 who gathered in parlors to listen to him preach, to sing the hymns together, the church ignored him. But when dozens and then eventually hundreds began to gather, the church could not ignore him. He began to burn books. Not any book. He burned the devotional books the Lutheran Church wrote to tell us when to pray and what to pray and how to pray. He burned the hymnals, and the church could no longer ignore him. He told me his story often. He preached this story, how he was afflicted with a terrible rheumatoid arthritis. His joints, they ached. And one day he was riding his horse and he fell from his horse. And he lay there wallowing in the dirt. And he prayed, Lord, take me. I cannot live like this. And he felt like a lightning bolt through his whole body. As he crawled up onto his knees and he began to pray, he heard a voice. And he knew it was the voice of God. Ask and you shall receive. If your faith is strong enough, nothing is impossible in the eyes of our Lord. And he prayed even more fervently to be forgiven for his lack of faithfulness. And he felt that electricity and he stood up. And he never felt that pain again. And so he fell back to his knees and he prayed in gratitude, offering his life in service to the Word, in service to our Lord. And that is when he began to travel and preach. But as more and more people gathered to hear him, the church could no longer ignore it. I remember one evening we were in the meeting house, our friend's parlor, and the authorities came to arrest him. They interrupted our prayers. And they said, are you Eric Johnson? And he stood up and said, I am. Then you are the man we are looking for. And as they went to arrest him, I stood up. Now, I am, as you can see, not a very large man. But I stood up with the force of God behind me. And then others stood up. And we walked towards the deputies. And we said, you have no business here. I shall care for Eric Johnson. And as we walked towards them, we slowed them, pushed them out of the parlor. And they left us that time. Another time, Eric was arrested. And as he was being taken to jail, we arranged to have several men on horseback interrupt the progress of the carriage. And as they created a distraction, others of us came up behind and we stole Eric Johnson from the carriage. And we secreted him away. Later, he dressed as a woman and he cross-country skied from Sweden over the mountains to Norway because he knew there was a bounty on his head. I had friends in Stockholm. George Scott, the Swedish Methodist and the industrialist. And so I arranged to hire a lawyer. And I met with the King of Sweden. And the King of Sweden decided he would not pursue Eric. He would let him go as long as he was gone and did not come back into Sweden. But then we were faced with a terrible choice. Would you go back to the Lutheran Church, which you have disavowed? Or would you follow this prophet to the new world? This is not a rhetorical question. How many of you would go? How many of you would stay? I sold my family farm. I paid for my wife, my children. I even paid for the hired hands and those who could not afford their own passage. And we sailed from Galva. Vi sålda våra hemmen, vi sålda våra hemmen, vi sålda våra hemmen. We sold our homes in Sweden and sailed away from friends. Like the bird that wings on southward when summer slowly ends, they return in the springtime to nest upon the strand. But we will never once again see our dear motherland. No, we will never once again see our dear motherland. Vi solda våra hemmen, vi solda våra hemmen, we sold our homes in Sweden. 6 ships sailed, several from Stockholm, others from Gävle. We sailed across the North Sea, across the North Atlantic, and we arrived in New York City. The moment we got down off the ship, we fell to our knees and prayed that we had traveled safely. We found out later that one of the ships went down off the coast of Nova Scotia and did not arrive so safely. We went to church, and the preacher, we found out, had locked the door. And he went on with an interminable sermon. But we had already purchased tickets on a boat, a steamboat that would take us up the Hudson River. And time was approaching for us to board. And the preacher resumed his interminable sermon. And so we began to sing in Swedish. Vi solda våra hemmen, all together. Vi solda våra hemmen. We grew louder and louder until eventually he unlocked the door and encouraged us to leave. We took a steamboat up the Hudson River to Albany, New York. We boarded a canal boat on the Erie Canal that had recently opened. We followed the Erie Canal from Albany to Buffalo. We boarded another boat that took us across Lake Erie, Lake St. Clair, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan to Chicago. And then we walked from Chicago to here. It had taken most of the spring and summer. It was already early fall by the time we arrived. This was the Western Wilderness. The food that we had brought with us on our journey, we had consumed along the way. And there were no farmers to sell us provisions, and winter was fast approaching. Right here, you see this sycamore tree. You see the culverts. Here was a gully. From the administrative building all the way across, it continues to the Edwards River. My little brother, Olaf Olson, he had gone ahead as a scout. When he arrived in New York City, he met Reverend Hellstrom. Reverend Hellstrom said he had a brother who lived in Victoria, another Reverend Hellstrom. The first Swedish Methodist church in Illinois is just south of here. Reverend Hellstrom said there's good property to the north. Rich prairie soil, an oak grove with timber, the Edwards River, which would provide year-round water. And so we purchased more than 20 acres as the Red Oak Grove. And we came. But that first winter, we dug into the walls of the gully. We made man-made caves. We put a log front and a hole in the back so we could have a fire, and the smoke drawn out that hole would draw heat through this dugout. Eric began to preach fasting because we had run out of provisions. And didn't Moses fast in the desert? And Jesus when he went to the mountain? And then he began to fast celibacy. We could not feed ourselves. We could not afford to bring others into the community. Several young people, they said, we did not sign on for celibacy, and they moved to Chicago. And they left. But not only did we survive the winter, though nearly 70 died of starvation and privation, most of us survived. And one of the first buildings we built was a log cabin church in the field just over here. And eventually, we built the church that you see standing there. It is the heart and soul of the community. There were 2 layers of apartments on the ground floor and the first floor, and the sanctuary above. We had learned to make brick from I believe it was a German or an English immigrant, and we set up our own brick mill. There's fine clay in the valley of the Edwards River. And young women helped to cut and to mold the brick, and we fired them in the grill, fired them in the kiln. And you can see the brick structures that were built. More than 1 million bricks were made to build all of these fine buildings. The administration buildings where commerce was done. The carpenter shop where we made furniture and the boxes for the wagons. The blacksmith and wagon hall where we put the wagons together. We sent emissaries to Pleasant Plains, Kentucky to study the Shaker communities. And the Shakers sold us cattle that were acclimated to the Midwestern temperatures. Cattle who could tolerate the heat of summer and the cold winters. But most important, they sold us seed for growing broom corn and the first device for making brooms, which we were able to replicate. And eventually, we planted more than 7,000 acres in broom corn and made thousands and thousands of brooms every year. We planted flax and made linen. We made miles of rugs. We built a hotel. And the general store was more of a showcase. So when businessmen came from as far away as Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, St. Louis, they could stay at the hotel. They could see the goods that we had made. And they could order hundreds of rugs. Rugs that are still made here at the Prairie Arts Center. Brooms you can still acquire today. We were the economic engine of Henry County. When cholera came, we knew that we must divide. We must separate because it is a highly communicable disease. And if you stay a certain distance apart, you're less likely to share that disease. We had fishing camps in Chillicothe, Illinois, along the Illinois River because we were fishermen from the Baltics. We had fishing camps at Rock Island. And so several community members moved there. We owned more than 14,000 acres. And so we moved to the four corners of the community. We only lost 128 to cholera. And most of us survived. But the doctor that we had hired, he took advantage. He insisted that he paid in livestock and not in the scrip, the paper money that we had printed. And he cured no one. It was about this time that a young man moved here by the name of John Root. John Root may or may not have been AWOL from the Swedish military. We know he was a riverboat gambler. He may or may not have been a scoundrel. But we do know when he saw the way that we worked together, all in common, to support the community, he thought maybe he could live more easily. He also thought that if he married the niece of the founder, Charlotta, Eric's niece, he would be in with the leader of the community. But before Eric allowed his niece to marry, he made John Root sign an agreement. I think you would call a prenuptial agreement. That if he wanted to leave and she wanted to stay, she could stay. When the cholera came, I have empathy for this man. He kidnapped his wife and child because he did not want them to die from cholera. He stole her away, though she did not want to leave. And when word spread that she wanted to come back, some of the elders in the community, we kidnapped her back. He came back and he threatened Eric. Eric hid in the cellar. He kidnaps his wife again, and he takes them to Chicago. Well, we had friends in Chicago, and the telegraph was sent that Charlotta was in Chicago, and she wanted to come home. And so we organized a series of horses, like the Pony Express, and we kidnapped Charlotta. We put her on a fast horse. She raced to another fast horse, another fast horse. When John Root woke up the next morning and wondered, where is my wife? Where is my son? He thought, I can catch up to a young woman with a child. But he was not fast enough to eat her dust. When he came here to find his wife, we would not give her up. And so he went to Cambridge and he organized a mob. He filled their heads with lies because Joseph Smith had recently been murdered and the Mormons had been chased out of Illinois. Even though the Governor Ford, had promised to protect him, Governor Ford looked the other way as he was murdered. It was easy for John Root to spread similar lies in Cambridge, to speak ill of our community. And so a mob came with torches and pitchforks to burn down the town. We met them at the northern edge of the village. We greeted them not with force, but with kindness. We answered their questions. We dispelled the myths. We invited them to fika, to tea and cookies. And the mob quickly dispelled. But then, John Root curses Eric Jansen and says, you will get yours. You will meet your maker, even if it is at my own hand. Now, because I had been the one who had kidnapped Charlotta, who had confronted him repeatedly, it was felt that maybe I should leave for my own protection. It was also at this time because of the debt with the doctor taking our livestock and the debt that we had to buy more livestock. The gold rush was opening. And so 9 of us left to travel west. We traveled first to Rock Island, and then we headed across Iowa. We met a party coming back from the gold rush who warned us to be careful with our cash, to be protective of our lives. They discouraged us to go. But it was about the same time we met another party from Wisconsin that was heading west, and we decided to throw in with them. It was March. On the 3rd day of the journey, it began to snow. The next day, we traveled a mean road in a black rain. We arrived at Council Bluffs and crossed the Missouri. And I tell you, if every dead horse and ox, every discarded wagon or piece of furniture were lined up in an even row, you could walk from Council Bluffs to California without ever touching the ground. Many men went seeking their fortune and lost their lives. If not to cholera and disease, it was starvation or privation or the Indians' arrows as we illegally crossed land that was protected in treaties and theirs. When we arrived in California, the shopkeepers charged more for 1 egg than you could buy a coop of chickens, a stick of butter. They all sang the glories of the gold rush, that you could come and you could strike it rich, though the only profits that were made were by the shopkeepers and the innkeepers. We never struck it rich. But I did meet a Swede by the name of Stoneberg. He had struck it rich, and I convinced him to join our community, and he helped to pay off some of our debt, so maybe that's the gold I was sent to find. But no sooner had I left than Eric Jansen was at the Cambridge courthouse trying to settle our debt. John Root was in the nearby courtroom for some nefarious deed. John Root hears Eric Jansen's voice. He burst into the courtroom. He took a pistol from the sheriff and he shoots Eric Jansen point blank 3 times into the chest, the heart, the lungs, and he falls dead. John Root is arrested. Eric's corpse is brought here. There were some who heard that word when he changed from being a prophet to being the prophet, whose faith was so strong that they sat by his grave for 3 days, fully expecting him to rise. And when that did not happen, the community was thrown into an upheaval. Eric had hoped that his son would take the helm of the community, but his son was 10 years old. His wife tried to position herself as the leader, and a telegraph was sent to San Francisco. And when I received word, I jumped on a ship at San Francisco Bay, and I sailed along the Pacific coast to Panama. I walked through the jungle, across the Panamanian Isthmus, from the Pacific to the Caribbean shore. I boarded another ship and sailed across the Caribbean to New Orleans. I boarded a steamboat that brought me up the Mississippi, up the Illinois to Peoria. From Peoria, I rode a carriage on the Galena Trail. When I arrived here, I arranged that I could take control with a council of 7. And the council of 7 incorporated the town as a business. In our papers of incorporation, I would like to think that my inspiration came from Thomas Jefferson in the founding of this nation. I think maybe Jefferson would appreciate these words, going a few steps beyond our Constitution. From the Articles of Incorporation, I wrote, "Our property and industry and the proceeds thereof shall constitute a common fund, by and with which it shall be the duty of the Board of Trustees to provide for the sustenance, comfort, and reasonable wants of every member of the colony, for the support of the aged and infirmed, for the care and the cure of the sick and the burial of the dead, and for the proper education of our children, and generally to do and transact any and all business necessary to the prosperity, happiness, and usefulness of the colony, consistent with the charter of Bishop Hill." This was our ideal. This is what we strive to build. And we built everything you see around us. Some of it even after the demise of Eric. We built the school, which still stands. We built a hospital, larger than our needs. We serve the surrounding community, ensuring the education and the well-being of the broader community. Our businesses continued to grow. It was then that the businessmen from Philadelphia, New York, St. Louis, and Chicago came to buy brooms, linen, and rugs. When the railroads offered to come through, we thought the railroads might bring riffraffs. And so we pushed the railroad a little further east, and we founded the town of Galva. We named Galva for the port where we had sailed from because it became our port. And many of those buildings you see today were brick made by Bishop Hillians. And our businesses continued to grow. But we never completely paid off our debts. And there was an economic downturn, I think you would say, an economic crisis. And the paper money that we had printed had lost value. And then the Civil War began. And many of our young men, they marched off to war. They joined the Union Army to fight for the freedoms for which this nation stands for. Company D served in every major battle in the Western Theater, from Belmont, Missouri, south, to Fort Henry and Donaldson, to Shiloh, the March on Vicksburg, Raymond and Chancellorsville, the Red River Campaign, all the way to New Orleans. And then they marched overland and they joined Sherman at Chickamauga and Chickasaw Mountain and Kennesaw Mountain. They fought at Atlanta and they marched to the sea. These men risked their lives, and many, because they were the knife blade that Sherman and Grant used to slice through enemy lines, gave their lives for the freedoms this nation stands for. The equality of all men and women. The freedom we came here to seek, to build upon. But at the beginning of the war, when we lost so many young men, and because of the debt that we never fully recovered from, in 1861, we decided to dissolve the community. And every person was given shares. Even women and children were all given shares. Now some families, like my own, who had contributed much and had been founders, we acquired a building or acreage. Some of this is still farmed by the descendants of our family. Others, like the women, one woman was a nurse. She was given a room in the hospital. The nurse's quarters became like her apartment. And she was given 5 acres in the woodlot so she had firewood to warm herself in the winter. Every shirt was counted and divided. Every silver spoon, yes, we had our own silversmith. Every article of material goods was divided fairly among the community members. The community still thrives because of the utopian dream that we have founded on. We still stand together and we work together. And it is a great honor that you have invited me to speak at your semi-demi-septicentennial. And I hope I can close with the closing words of the speech I delivered at the 50th anniversary. And I hope these words still ring true, knowing that there has been economic and cultural turmoil. I hope that we can work together to protect and preserve what is left, and won't be lost. I close my speech then, and I will today, with these words. It would be a great comfort if we in our old age could be spared witnessing the destruction that has recently threatened us. And if our descendants, after we have gone on to our fathers, have nobler things to view when looking back upon a bygone days than a ruined place, intended as a dwelling for the people of God. Vi sold av våra hemmen, vi sold av våra hemmen. We sold our homes in Sweden and sailed away from friends. Like the bird that wings on southward when summer slowly ends, it returns in the springtime to nest upon the strand. But we will never once again see our dear motherland. No, we will never once again see our dear motherland. Vi sold av våra hemmen, vi sold av våra hemmen, we sold our homes in Sweden. So were any of you here for the 50th anniversary? How many descendants of the founders of this community do we have present today? I'm glad to see at least one. Any questions about the origins, about the early days? What would you like to know?
What was the attitude of other residents of Henry County when you arrived with the other settlers?
When we arrived, this was the Western Wilderness. And we had very few neighbors. Cambridge had already been founded, and actually to hear more about the opinions of our neighbors, in November, Benjamin Dunn Walsh will speak. But I will tell you this much. When Eric was murdered and John Root was held in prison, Benjamin Dunn Walsh wrote a letter to the governor. He was one of the founders of Cambridge, from Cambridge, where he was a professor. And he wrote a letter asking for the pardon of John Root. And the governor granted that pardon. He argued that it was a lover's dispute and that his wife had been stolen from him. And he wrote disparagingly of the community. And I'll answer that in more detail maybe in November. But that gives you a general idea. Yes? The Cambridge Courthouse, Henry County Courthouse. You know, I think the courthouse there today was built shortly after our 50th anniversary. So it's not the one that's standing, but more or less the same site. Yes?
How old were you when you sold everything and left Sweden?
I was still a young man. I was 94 at the 50th anniversary. So I was 44 when I left Sweden. Yes?
You say something about the religious life of the community after Jansen's death and your role in it.
That is a most excellent question. Thank you for asking. For those who didn't hear, she's asking about the religious life of the community after the death of Eric Jansen. Now, because of my background with the Swedish Methodists, one of the first churches built in town, still standing, where churches still served, is a Methodist church. Some of the followers moved to Pleasant Plains, Kentucky, because they wanted to maintain that more religious life. A handful joined the Shakers. Many of us became Seventh-day Adventists, knowing that soon our Lord would return as predicted in the Bible in the second coming. And so we were split not evenly. A small percentage went to Kentucky, a few became Methodist, but I believe more joined the Seventh-day Adventists, and I became a minister and served every Sunday offering services and preaching to the community. Yes?
So how did they establish initially their land base? Was that a homesteading thing, or what was that?
The land was purchased. Originally 20-something acres. The region had recently opened because of the treaty with the Potawatomi after the construction of the I&M Canal. A lot of this land was opened, and the Potawatomi Trail runs just north of here.
Could you speak a little more about the relationship with Galva?
With Galva. Okay, because we are living in America, we do use the English enunciation. Gävle in Sweden, Galva in Illinois. And so some of the first businesses in Galva were actually extensions of Bishop Hill. And when the railroad came through, that's how we shipped 1,000 brooms and miles of rugs. And a lot of Swedes who left the community when the community dissolved simply moved to Galva and built their businesses there. So John Root's son became a very successful lawyer in Galva, and John Root's son helped to found the Bishop Hill Old Settlers Association, which has hosted our 50th anniversary and invited me to speak. Olaf Kranz, our most famous painter, he served as a house painter, painting interiors. One of his specialties was taking cheap wood and painting the grain to look like more expensive wood. Taking wood and painting it to look like marble. Creating faux finishes. And I understand there are still a dozen houses in Galva that treasure those faux finishes, knowing it was painted by Olaf Kranz. So a lot of the businesses in Galva grew as a direct extension of Bishop Hill. And I should also maybe say, we sent letters back. Some of what you just heard was quoted from some of those letters that we sent to Sweden. And there were many Swedes who did not want to join the utopian community, but they were drawn by the land and the opportunity. And so Augustana College might have been in Galva, and that's why the park is preserved. And so a lot of the Swedes at Augustana and Rock Island, Rockford, in St. Paul, Minneapolis, in Quincy, and in Lindsborg, Kansas, huge wave of Swedes came because of the letters that were sent home from Bishop Hill. How many of you are Swedish? Maybe you could visit the Vasa and see what your connection is, whether you're a direct descendant or you're someone who came because of those letters. Thank you very much for listening.
That was fun. You know, I don't usually get to watch myself, and I enjoyed that. I will admit it's a great story. Thanks to the Bishop Hill Heritage Association for helping to research and develop that program, and the Swedish Council for helping to fund my research and development of that program. If you come to Bishop Hill, I do walking tours of the town, and the Heritage also offers walking tours. And it's a great way to get to know each of the places and the stories behind each of those places. Please, if you have any questions, type them into the chat there. If you look to the right, you'll see the chat. We do have questions coming from a couple of different sources. So one of the questions that came in earlier in the program, when I mentioned that Jonas's father may have had a problem with drink, was this a prohibitionist community? And actually, the community made their own beer. It was a low alcohol beer, but they would take the grain and ferment, and extract nutrients. And then they would dry the grain and grind it and make bread. And so the building where the ball field is now was called the Bakery Brewery. And that way they got nutrients from that grain twice. And, with cholera being a thing, boiling water to make the wort, to make the beer, was a great way to sterilize the water to prevent cholera. And it was a very low alcohol beer, so even kids drank it, and it was nutritious. Good beer is nutritious in that way. So no, they were not a prohibitionist community, to answer that question more directly. Someone else had asked about maple syrup. I think they know that I make maple syrup. And it actually, yes, historically, one of my favorite letters, there's this wonderful book called In the Land of Milk and Honey. And it's a collection of letters sent from America to Sweden. And many of these letters were published in the Swedish newspapers, and they were a real, call to America. Please come, and the soil is rich, the land is free. And if any of you watching have Swedish ancestry who settled anywhere in the Midwest, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Rockford, Rock Island, Lindsborg, Kansas, wherever your relatives are, if you have a Swedish ancestor who came in that time period, it is highly likely they read a letter that could have been from Bishop Hill. Matter of fact, that book I mentioned, In the Land of Milk and Honey, the title of the book is taken from the first letter in the book. And it was written by somebody from Bishop Hill, published in a newspaper in Sweden. And he kind of goes through the bullet points of the land of Canaan, the biblical passage. This is the land of milk and honey. And he says, I'll never forget the quote, we extract sugar from the trees in the spring and squeeze it from the stalks of corn in the fall. And so they're making maple syrup and they're making sorghum. And we still make sorghum. If you come to Jordbruksdagarna, our ag days in September, you can participate in making sorghum. Good questions. If you have another question, please type it there in the chat. Somebody had asked about the role of women. Was this a matriarchal or patriarchal community? And were they behind the times, ahead of the times? I would say that they were very much ahead of the times. Last year was 175th anniversary. And if you go to the Bishop Hill Heritage Association website, or go to their YouTube channel, there's a series of lectures. They invited 10 guest scholars over the course of the year to explore different perspectives on Bishop Hill history. And one of my favorite is a scholar from Seattle, though she has roots in Bishop Hill. She is a direct descendant. And she gave this wonderful lecture on the role of women in Bishop Hill. I mentioned Olaf Kranz, the painter. There are two of my favorite paintings. One is women pile driving. They're actually, a team of women, each of them pulling on a rope to lift this huge log that then drives down and pushes the pile in to help make a dam so they could create hydro power and have a mill race. And then there's also a painting of women who are planting the grain, and it looks like a 24-row corn planter. It's a wonderful painting. So clearly the women played a very pivotal role and very important in the economic and spiritual life of the community. The other really cool story that I love to tell, I learned from a guest at the Twin Flower Inn Bed and Breakfast. They said that their great-great-grandmother was a nurse at the colony hospital. And when the colony was dissolved, everything was divided, as I mentioned during the program. But even women were given property. And their grandmother had been given a room because she was a nurse, the nurse's quarters. And she was given 5 acres, so she had firewood. So women and children were given shares. Back to the question, were they, ahead or behind? I think they were very much ahead of the times. And I think that's also very much reflected in Swedish culture, a culture of strong women and women in politics and women who are decision makers. Swedes are my role models in that regard. I married a strong woman. One more question. We got time for a couple of more. Go ahead and type one in the chat. Somebody's asking about marrying, and because it was a closed community, where did they go to find their brides? That reminds me of another one of my favorite stories. So when they first arrived, I think I did mention this in the program, that it was winter and they were hungry, and so he began to preach not just fasting because they didn't have much food, but also celibacy because this is not a time to bring children into the world when you can't feed yourself. So after things turned around, then they had mass weddings. And there's several accounts of like one Sunday, 19 people got married, and another Sunday, 22 people got married, and another Sunday, 16 marriages. You get a wife, you get a husband. And so they mostly married within the community because there were a lot of families among the nearly 1,000 immigrants. The question asked, well, did they travel to Galva to find wives? Well, I kind of answered that in the Q&A there, that Galva was built in large part by Bishop Hill. People from Bishop Hill really helped Galva to grow. We have time for another question? Something else you want to know? Oh, somebody was asking about the vote and who was president. So the communal life was started in 1846. The speech that you just heard was delivered in 1896 when Jonas Olson was in his 90s. It was the 50th anniversary of the commune, and he was looking back, and so a lot of the speech is based on notes from that occasion. So I don't have good records about how they voted in every election, but I know that Millard Fillmore would have been president, during the final days of the commune. They dissolved at the beginning of the Civil War, so Abraham Lincoln would have been president. And then I think it was Grover Cleveland near the end. A related question that you didn't ask, but this reminds me, is what about slavery? And there isn't a good written record. I cannot document their opinion about abolitionism and the end of slavery, but I think action speaks louder than words. The fact that they enlisted an entire company and that all of these young men went off to fight the war to not only save the Union, but to liberate African Americans, because they understood the value of labor in this communal society. And slavery was a sin. Slavery was wrong. I mean, even in the Old Testament, didn't Moses free the Israelites? So, of course, they were, I would say, maybe not abolitionists the way a lot of people would define it, but they clearly enlisted in droves. And if action speaks louder than words, then it says that they fought hard. They fought in every major battle in the Western theater, following Grant at first, and then when Grant moved east, they were under the command of Sherman. And actually, Todd DeDecker did a wonderful exhibit with some great documentation on the Civil War. And we do have a wonderful Civil War monument in the town square. So, well, we have just a couple minutes before our next speaker. So if you wanted to quickly get something to drink, take care of business, we'll be back in just a few minutes with Joe Hill. But while we are waiting for that, I am going to go ahead and take just another second here to thank our sponsors. Of course, we could not do this without the support of the Bishop Hill Heritage Association. The Bishop Hill Heritage Association has sponsored the Chautauqua for 9 years, and you know, they help to publicize and promote, and Todd and I work together as the core, but it's really their committee and Lou Lordeau and a lot of people who help to support the sound system and setting up of chairs. And Bishop Hill has a great team of volunteers. If you're going to come out some Thursday morning, you can help the Heritage Association with a project every Thursday. We also received some funding from the American Scandinavian Foundation, as I mentioned, Jonas Olson in particular. I got a small grant to do the research and writing, develop that show. I believe our next character, Joe Hill, also received a grant from the American Scandinavian Foundation. The Barbara Osher Pro Suiza Foundation has been very supportive of Bishop Hill in general. The Illinois Arts Council funds a lot of the programs that we put together. And Bill and Susan Sherrard Foundation has also been gracious and generous in supporting some of the programming. And then Suia Chicago and the Twin Flower Inn Bed and Breakfast are a couple of our sponsors as well. So well, you know, since we do have just another minute, let me also just give you a little background on what is Chautauqua. I love the word. Can you say Chautauqua? It's actually Algonquin. And in upstate New York, in the Finger Lake District, when the fish go into the rivers to spawn, the indigenous people would gather there to harvest the fish. They would feast, but they would also smoke and preserve a lot of the fish, and it fed them through the year. And so Chautauqua technically means fish kill. And the original Chautauqua, there's some debate. I side with Lakeside, Ohio, that then created this school for Sunday school teachers at Chautauqua, New York, which is where the word comes from. And Bishop Hill's had a Chautauqua for 9 years, and I am, you know, the artistic director, but I also perform every year and have a great group of friends who help. And so recently, partnering with these various friends, we've created History in Person. It is a YouTube channel. It's soon to be a website I'm in the process of building, and a Facebook page. And our goal is no less than really reviving this art of stepping into character. I just got a grant from Colorado Humanities to build 6 modules for students and teachers. So if you have any friends who are teachers, send them to the YouTube channel, because every day this week, a new video module, a new how-to chapter on research and writing and developing your own characters. If you are an adult Chautauqua, I know a few of you are out there who are researching a character now with Nebraska or North Dakota Humanity. That's right. North Dakota Humanities is doing a really great program to train the next generation of Chautauqua. So my videos, with the help of a lot of my friends, will hopefully provide some fodder. And of course, Colorado Humanities has been a big sponsor of History in Person as we develop these young Chautauqua modules, stepping into character. Yeah. So, you know, part of the point of History in Person, the question we ask students, if you could meet anybody in history, who would that be? Even better yet, you know, not just a handshake, but if you could step into their shoes and become that character, What stories might you tell? That's the big point of Chautauqua. It gives us a chance to step back in time and spend some quality time. Like the character that you're about to meet here in just another minute or two is one of my heroes. Um, Joe Hill was a Swedish immigrant who came here as a young man and was very involved in the labor movement. He was not only a songwriter who used his music to help motivate workers and to organize workers, but then songs were written about him because he was such a legendary character. And Bucky Hawker, the next performer, is on the Humanities Council roster. He helped to create the Rhodes Scholar program and helped to create this series of programs that's now been going on for more than 20 years. I've been on the list for about that many myself, and it created before I moved to Illinois. But Bucky helped to manage that program for many moons and has developed several really wonderful programs. If you were lucky enough to be in Bishop Hill this fall, he performed not as Woody Guthrie, but he told the story of Woody Guthrie in Illinois. And it just repeatedly blew my mind. I didn't realize that Woody Guthrie had spent so much time in Illinois, living in Chicago, stationed here when he was in the military. And a lot of his songwriting and union organizing was in Illinois as well. But that's another character. Bucky Hawker telling the story of Woody Guthrie. This evening, we are going to meet Joe Hill. And I think we're about ready for that. Are you ready? Let's turn it over to Joe Hill, actually to Bucky Hawker telling the story of Joe Hill.
This particular tune borrows the tune from a song written in Chicago in 1864 by George Root. He wrote some songs, hymns and other songs, and a famous Civil War song called Tramp, 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 which was among the most popular songs of the Civil War for the Union Army. Joe Hill learned it, takes it, and writes this song called The Tramp. If you law will shut your trap, I would tell you about a chap. He was broken up against it too for fair. He was not the kind to shirk, he was looking hard for work, but he heard that same old story everywhere. Tramp, 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 keep on a-trampin'. There's nothing doing here for you. If I catch you round again, you will wear the ball and chain. Keep on tramping, that's the best thing you can do. He walked up and down the street till his shoes fell off his feet. In his house he spied a lady cooking stew. Well, he said, how do you do? May I chop some wood for you? But what the lady told him made him feel so blue. Tramp, 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 keep on a-trampin'. There's nothing doing here for you. If I catch you round again, you will wear the ball and chain. Keep on tramping, that's the best thing you can do. Across the street, a sign he read, worked for Jesus, so it said. And he said, here is my chance, I'll surely try. Well, he knelt down on the floor till his knees got rather sore. But at eating time he heard that preacher say, tramp, 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 keep on a-trampin'. There's nothing doing here for you. If I catch you round again, you will wear the ball and chain. Keep on tramping, that's the best thing you can do. Down the street he met a cop, and the copper made him stop. And he asked him, when did you roll into town? Come with me up to the judge. But the judge just said, oh fudge, bums that have no money, they needn't come around. Tramp, 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 keep on a-trampin'. There's nothing doing here for you. And And if I catch you around again, you will wear the ball and chain. Keep on trapping, that's the best thing you can do. Finally came that happy day when his life did pass away, and he was sure he'd go to heaven when he died. When he reached that pearly gate, St. Peter, that mean old skate, slammed the gate right in his face and loudly cried. He said, now tramp, 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 keep on a-trapping. Nothing doing here for you. And if I catch you round again, you will wear that ball and chain. Keep on tramping, that's the best thing you can do. Keep on tramping, that's the best thing you can do. Thank you. The Tramp by Joe Hill. You can see some themes in there that come up again and again a lot in protest songs in the 19th and early 20th century. One is a kind of anti-clerical stance you heard in there because until the 1930s, the majority of the American clergy, with the exception of some renegade priests, a few Protestant preachers, and some Jewish rabbis, were really conservative, against child labor legislation, minimum wage laws, labor reform, unions, you name it. They just told you to, go to church and be holy and you'll get your reward in heaven. So you could sense that he's making fun of the church, he's making fun of the police, making fun of just the general public for being so hostile towards people who really couldn't help it. Because it was the late 19th, early 20th century. It wasn't exactly like the Great Depression, but at least in the 1890s, it was really a bad situation. Lots of people were out of work and they had to go on the tramp. So he was trying to write stuff to support them. He joined a union called the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, founded in Chicago in 1905 by people like Eugene Debs and Father Haggerty, a renegade Catholic priest, and a few other people. And their goal was to overthrow capitalism and set up a workers' commonwealth. They were opposed to the Socialist Party. They also fought the Communist Party later on. Their feeling was that workers should set up the system within their work environments to try to run the production system in the United States. Really an interesting union and had a big impact in different parts of the world. There were even IWW chapters that were quite large and had some impact in places like Hawaii, Australia, and New Zealand. So I'm going to play you another song with a little Illinois connection. This is one that Carl Sandburg picked up more than once when he was collecting songs. It's based on the popular song of the day called Casey Jones, the engineer. He dies in a wreck. And there's at least some folklorists who say that the original Casey Jones was from Illinois. And we do know it was a popular song here, but Joe Hill decided he'd take it in a little different direction, so I'll tell you the story. Some of you might know engineers were called the aristocracy, part of the aristocracy of the working class, because they were highly skilled, got well paid, often didn't give a damn about the brakemen or the gandy dancers or anybody else that was working below them. So this kind of mocks that attitude. And as I said, Casey Jones. And the SP line I use in here, that's the Southern Pacific, which was a notorious anti-labor railroad run by Jay Gould in the United States. Once said the best thing you could do to striking workers is to shoot them with a Gatling gun. Yep, that was the guy. The workers on the SP line to strike sent out a call. Casey Jones, the engineer, he wouldn't strike at all. His boiler, it was leaking. His drive was on the bum, and his engine and his bearings, they were all out of plumb. Casey Jones kept his junk pile running. Casey Jones was always working double time. Well, Casey Jones got himself a wooden medal for being good and faithful on the SP line. The workers said to Casey, now help us win the strike. But Casey Jones said, let me alone, you ought to take a hike. Then Casey's wheezy engine ran right off the worn-out track, and Casey hit the river with an awful crack. Casey Jones hit the river bottom. Casey Jones, he broke his blooming spine. Well, Casey Jones became an Angelino. He took a trip to heaven on the SP line. Casey got to heaven right up to the pearly gate. He said, I'm Casey Jones, I haul the SP freight. Well, you're just a man, said Peter, the musician's on strike. You can get a job scabbing anytime you like. Casey Jones got a job in heaven. Casey Jones thought he was doing mighty fine. Well, Casey Jones went scabbing on the Angels, just like he did the workers on the SP line. Got to heaven. They said this isn't fair for Casey Jones to go around scabbing everywhere. The Angels Union 23, they sure were there, and they promptly fired Casey down that golden stair. Casey Jones went to hell a-flying. Casey Jones, the devil said, oh, fine. Well, Casey Jones, get busy shoveling sulfur. That's what you get for scabbing on the SP line. That's what you get for scabbing on the SP line. It's what you get for scabbing on the SP line. Casey Jones, that's the song. As you can see here, he's very pro-labor. So I'm going to switch things around here and I'll explain why in just a second. If nothing else, this will let cooler air circulate around part of my body anyway. Playing guitar is not fun in hot weather for some reason, though I've done it a lot. Joe Hill made a trip to Hawaii as a longshoreman, which is how they often spread the gospel of labor around the world. At that time, they would hop on ships, work in different places, and take the songs with them. And he went to Hawaii and stayed there. We don't quite know how long. Went with a friend of his. They lived on the beach. They spent time with the native Hawaiian longshoremen and learned music from them and taught them songs and vice versa. And I always figured, well, I don't know for sure, but that was at exactly the time that the U.S. was building up its larger imperial holdings, and people were interested in Hawaii. And Hawaiian music began to catch on quickly in the U.S., including the ukulele, and then after that the slide, which turns into the slide guitar, dobro, pedal steel guitar. This is a song which uses a tune from a song called Sunlight, Sunlight, which was a popular vaudeville Tin Pan Alley tune in this era from 1913. And as you listen to the words, you'll hear some things, just as a little bit of background to it. The U.S. got involved in the Spanish-American War in 1898. Nobody's quite sure what happened. I mean, the battleship Maine was blown up in the harbor, and some people think it was certain key people, wealthy Spaniards from Cuba, trying to get the U.S. involved, since they controlled Cuba. Some people think it might have been people from the U.S. Nobody really knows, but it started a war, and many people died. So I will play you a song that's got definitely it's suspicious of the military. As I was hiking round the town to find a job one day, saw a sign, 1,000 men were wanted right away. to take a trip around the world in Uncle Sammy's fleet. I signed my name a dozen times upon that great big sheet. Stung right, S-T-U-N-G. Stung right, easy mark, that's me. When my term is over and again I'm free, there'll be no more trips around the world for me. The man, he said, our U.S. fleet, it is no place for slaves. For everything you have to do is stand and watch the waves. But in the morn at 5 o'clock, they woke me from my snooze to scrub the deck and polish brass and shine the captain's shoes. Stung right, S-T-U-N-G. I was stung right, easy mark, that's free. When my term is over and again I'm free, there'll be no more trips around the world for me. One day a dude in uniform at me began to shout. I simply plugged him in the jaw and knocked him down and out. Slammed me right in irons then and said, you are a case. On bread and water, then I lived for 27 days. Stung right, S-T-U-N-G. Stung right, easy mark, that's me. When my term is over and again I'm free, there'll be no more trips around this world for me. Some time ago when Uncle Sam had a war with Spain, many of the boys in blue were in the battle slain. Not all were killed by bullets though, not by any means. The biggest part were killed by armor, pork, and beans. Stung right, S-T-U-N-G. Stung right, easy mark, that's me. When my term is over and again I'm free, there'll be no more trips around the world for me. There'll be no more trips around the world for me. Oh, I was blowing reveille there for you. I should mention that last verse is actually true about the biggest part were killed by armor, pork, and beans. Number of people who died in the Spanish-American War for the U.S., 2/3 of them were killed by contaminated rations. Almost all of them packed in guess what town? Yeah. Chicago, the packing houses. There was an investigation, of course, but nothing ever happened to the head of armor and the other major packing houses. So anyway, that is a true story at the end. Joe Hill was arrested in 1914 in Salt Lake City. I just look around and think how many people I see here, if they went to Salt Lake City today, might still get arrested. Sorry. I lived in Idaho for a long time, which borders Utah. And yeah, I'm not going to get into it. It's an interesting place, I'll say that. So I'm going to play a song that he wrote while he was in jail. He was executed in 1915. He was charged with murder. There was no evidence, literally no evidence, other than the fact that he was outside of town, in fact, staying outside of town, but he was known to the authorities by then because he was involved with the IWW and had been around the country singing songs and playing them, and some of them were getting well known in among labor groups and made him an object of suspicion on the part of the authorities. So when a small grocery store shopkeeper was killed in Salt Lake in the city, Joe Hill was arrested, charged with murder, and eventually executed. Many people intervened, including the King of Sweden, asked for a stay of execution, and even President Wilson also sought to intervene and stop the execution, the President of the United States at that time. The governor of Utah, a quite conservative man and well aligned with the mining interests in the state, and Joe Hill had been involved in some of the strikes against the mines there, and up into Utah and Idaho and so on, silver mines. So he was made a kind of ritual sacrifice, I guess you could say. But he wrote this song for Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a young woman at the time involved in social reform in the U.S. She came to visit him, and he wrote a song for her called Rebel Girl. There are women of many descriptions in this queer world, as everyone knows. Some are living in beautiful mansions. They are wearing the finest of clothes. There are blue-blooded queens and princesses who have charms made of diamonds and pearls. But the only thoroughbred lady is a rebel girl. That's a rebel girl, that's a rebel girl. To the working class, she's a precious pearl. She brings courage, pride, and joy to a fighting rebel boy. We've had girls before, but we need some more in the industrial workers of the world. Yes, it's great to fight for freedom with a rebel girl. Yes, her hands may be hardened from labor, and her dress may not be very fine, but a heart in her bosom is beating. That is true to her class and her kind. And the grafters in terror are trembling when her spite and defiance she hurls. For the only and thoroughbred lady was a rebel girl. That's a rebel girl, that's a rebel girl. To the working class, she's a precious pearl. She brings courage, pride, and joy to a fighting rebel boy. We've had girls before, but we need some more in the industrial workers of the world. Yes, it's great to fight for freedom with a rebel girl. Yes, it's great to fight for freedom with a rebel girl. People ask, well, how did his songs get circulated? Well, a lot of times they were... we got a bird call man in the back row there. Did you call those birds in for us? Did you do that? No, he's not nodding his head in agreement. Just kidding. It's one of my favorite pastimes during the COVID crisis was to try to learn how to do the Cardinal and the red-winged Blackbird. Joe Hill's songs were published in papers, but they were also circulated with a lot of the workers who rode the freight trains to get around to find work. There were a lot of migrant workers in the U.S., millions of them in this time period, and Joe Hill's songs would be carried around the country to different places. They were also published in this, which is still published to this day, the Little Red Songbook. This is a facsimile of the 1923 edition. The origins of these little songbooks have to do with the history of Protestantism, the Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening. evangelical Christians of all political persuasions used to have little songbooks they'd publish. Why? You can put them in your pocket, bring them to your camp meeting. Simple tunes, simple songs to sing. So Labor does this. They start doing it, believe me, just after the end of the Civil War. And Joe Hill's songs, he's got more songs in here than any other individual author. So that's where many of those came from. So I just wanted to mention that. I think my pages just got blown over here, so I want to get back and make, you got to sing a song, right? You haven't done that yet, so we got to make you do this one. All right, this was his most popular song, and when I was doing research on Joe Hill, I discovered that this song has been published and sung and recorded in the United States and Canada, but also Germany, England, Australia, New Zealand, Italy, France, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland. So it's made the rounds. South Africa, too, now that I think of it, it was published down there as well. So it was very popular. Usually sung on street corners, often in competition with the Salvation Army. They were trying to save souls. The IWW was trying to get you to get some food somewhere and a decent wage. So your job is just to sing along with me. It's sort of like lining out, an old tradition in Protestantism. I'll sing you the line, you answer me, okay, when we get to the chorus. And again, it's making fun of established Protestant Christianity. I should mention, too, that as a child, Joe Hill did go to Salvation Army meetings, so he was well schooled in these songs and the melodies and, yeah, the message. So, long-haired preachers come out every night, try to tell you what's wrong and what's right. But when you ask them for something to eat, they will answer in voices so sweet. You will eat by and by, in that glorious land in the sky, Work and pray, live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. That's a lie. Yeah, you say that's a lie at the end of each one of those, okay? Well, the Starvation Army band plays. They sing and they clap and they pray till they get all your coins on their drum. Then they'll tell you that you're just a bum. You will eat by and by in that glorious land in the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You get pride in the sky when you die. That's a lie. Holy rollers and jumpers come out. They holler, they jump, and they shout. Give your money to Jesus, they say. He will cure all diseases today. You will eat by and by in that glorious land in the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. That's a lie. If you fight hard for your children and wife, you try to get some of the good things in life, you're just a sinner and a bad man, they tell. When you die, you go straight off to hell. You will eat by and by in that glorious land in the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You get pie in the sky when you die. That's a lie. Working folks from all countries unite. Side by side in our freedom we'll fight. When the world and its wealth we have gained, to those grafters we'll sing this refrain. You will eat by and by when you learn how to cook and to fry. Cook and fry. Chop some wood. That'll do you good. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. That's a lie. There you go. I should also mention the tune for that was another one he took from a very popular Protestant hymn that was made popular by Dwight Moody and Ira Sankey, the gospel preacher and his choir director living in Chicago at the time. Joe has a reputation for being, kind of tough, and his lyrics sarcastic. Yeah, making fun of the established order and his quest for workers' justice. Oh, there's a black ant on a ukulele. That's a new one. That could be a song. I got black ants on my ukulele. Well, I guess better there than on my steak at night, right? So, but the irony of this is, like he told his guard at the prison in Salt Lake, you've already got 2 wives, Mormon at the time. Polygamy was it illegal but still practiced? Well, I mean, a lot of it's still practiced in Utah. But anyway, he told the guard, I know that from experience. Not me, but yeah. He said, you have 2 wives, I'm never going to have any. This was shortly before he was executed. But he really did want to have a love life, and he knew he wasn't going to have that. This was a song that was found in the place where he was staying outside of Salt Lake. Called My Dreamland Girl. He wrote a couple of these. I got another 1 or 2 from the archives in Sweden that they found later on. They're kind of romantic tunes. So there was no music for this, so I tried to take this sort of standard, sort of vaudeville, early Tin Pan Alley chord progression and melody and use this. These songs like this, I should mention, instead of thinking Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, you're better off to think Rudy Valley and Kate Smith. They'd be closer stylistically to what Joe was at least writing in the genre. Here we go. It's called My Dreamland Girl. Would you like to get acquainted with my dreamland girl divine? Never was a picture painted fairer than this girl of mine. Sweet and graceful like a pansy, bright and charming like a pearl. She's the idol of my fancy, she's my own dreamland girl. Charming fairy queen of my dreams, ere before me her face brightly beamed. Night and day I'm dreaming of you. Someday my sweet dreams perhaps will come true. Someday my sweet dreams perhaps will come true. She is coy and captivating, Venus-like in grace and pose, with an air more fascinating than the fragrance of a rose. Like the stars her eyes are shining, neath a wealth of golden hair. My heart is ever pining for my Greenland girl so fair. Charming fairy queen of my dreams, ere before me your face brightly beams. Night and day I'm dreaming of you. Someday my sweet dreams perhaps will come true. Someday my sweet dreams perhaps will come true. Charming fairy queen of my dreams, ere before me your face brightly beams. Night and day I'm dreaming of you. Someday my sweet dreams perhaps will come true. Someday my sweet dreams perhaps will come true. Just adds a nice little alternate sort of interpretation of Joel and what he was thinking. I guess I should finish up, so I'm torn on this. I think I'll... Tony, do you want to hear Mr. Block? That's my wife back there, because if I don't play what she wants, I'll hear about it later in the car home. Do you want to hear Mr. Block, or do you want There Was Power in the Union? What? Okay, we'll play Mr. Block. This is a song that borrows the tune from a big 1908 hit called It Looks Like a Big Night Tonight, which was written by Van Alstyne and Harry Williams on 78 RPM record all over the place, and all the little bands that came around and played the opera houses in places like Macomb or the Quad Cities, Moline, Ashland, Wisconsin, would have likely played that song in 1910, 1912. So Joe took this and wrote this other song called Mr. Block. Joe was also a cartoonist and contributed a lot to the IWW newspaper. And I should mention the IWW, in terms of the history of American humor, clearly had a role in the development of sarcasm in the humor of American society, because they do a lot of it. In this particular case, they had a term for the people who were like always willing to work overtime for no extra pay or do crazy jobs that they weren't paid enough for. They were often referred, or wouldn't join the union even when given an opportunity, like if they worked in the early auto plant or something like that. Rather, they would just, instead of calling them, I don't know, fellow workers, they called them blockheads. And they would have cartoons of these guys with a square or a rectangle over the top of their head. So Joe wrote this song. And I will mention one thing in here. You'll hear about the Spanish-American War again, but also the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which was founded in the 1870s, still exists today. In its early years, until it was forced to bring in the auto workers, the Caterpillar workers, let's see who else I can think of, textile workers, women, African Americans, so they were forced to do that in the 30s. It was mostly skilled workers, like my grandfather, who happened to be a bricklayer in Chicago for 54 years. Why, I don't know, but he kept working there. But it was mostly the really skilled workers, the carpenters and the bricklayers and electricians and stuff that were in the AFL. So the industrial workers of the world tried to organize everybody. So they would, go in and take on difficult tasks. Organizing African-American longshoremen in New Orleans, that would cost your life. Many IWW members were lynched and hanged, and yes, even some that were veterans of World War I were killed by the very early forms of the American Legion in the United States. So here is a song called Mr. Block, where he makes fun of the AFL for being so conservative. Please give me your attention. I'll introduce to you a man that is a credit to the great red, white, and blue. I feel like I should have a megaphone, and I could, yes. His head is made of lumber, solid as a rock. He is a common worker. His name is Mr. Block. Block, he thinks he may be president someday. Oh, Mr. Block, you were born by mistake. You take the cake. You make me ache, tie a rock round your block and then jump in the lake. Kindly do that for liberty's sake. Yeah, Mr. Block got lucky, he found a job by G. The shark got $7 for the job at Fair and Feed. They shipped him to the desert and dumped him with his truck. But when he tried to find his job, he sure was out of luck. He shouted, "That's too raw, I'll fix them with the law." Oh, Mr. Block, you were born by mistake. You take the cake, you make me ache, tie a rock around your block and then jump in the lake. Kindly do that for liberty's sake. Oh, Block hiked to the city 'cause he wasn't doing well. He said, "I'll join the union, the great AFL." He got a job next morning, got fired in the night. He said, "I'll see Sam Gompers and he'll fix the foreman right." Gompers said, "You see, yeah, you got our sympathy." Oh, Mr. Block, you were born by mistake. You take the cake. You make me ache, tie a rock around your block and then jump in the lake. Kindly do that for liberty's sake. The money kings in Cuba blew up the gunboat Maine. Block got awful angry and blamed it all on Spain. So he went right into battle, there he lost his leg. Now he's peddling shoestrings and walking on a peg. He shouts, remember Maine, hurrah to hell with Spain. Oh, Mr. Block, you were born by mistake. You take the cake, you make me ache. Tie a rock around your block and then jump in the lake. Kindly do that for liberty's sake. Poor Block, he died one evening, I'm very glad to state. He climbed that golden ladder right up to the pearly gate. He said, oh, Mr. Peter, one word I'd like to tell. Oh, please, I'd like to meet the Astor Bells in John D. Rockefeller. Pete said, is that so? I'm sorry, you'll find them down below. Oh, Mr. Block, you were born by mistake. You take the cake, you make me ache. Tie a rock around your block and then jump in the lake. Kindly do that for liberty's sake. Kindly do that for liberty's sake. Okay. Well, I think I'll call it the end of my set, but if you got any questions, please fire away. I'm glad to field anything you might have before Brian gets up here. And yes.
Do you know where Joe Hill was buried?
His ashes have been spread in various places, so I'm not quite sure what the exact answer would be. Yes. In fact, hang on just a second. Let me read this to you. That was a good question. Let me read his last will from 1915. He wrote this just before he died. My will is easy to decide, for there is nothing to divide. My kin don't need to fuss and moan. Moss does not cling to a rolling stone. My body, oh, if I could choose, I would want to ashes it reduce, and let the merry breezes blow my dust to where some flowers grow. Perhaps some fading flower then would come to life and bloom again. This is my last and final will. Good luck to all of you, Joe Hill. That was the last thing he put out before he died. Yeah. So I guess that sort of answers your question. Yes. Yes.
A lot of these songs end with the verse about going to heaven.
Yes.
What do you think that means, that he does that so often?
Well, that's an interesting question because it comes up a lot in the labor protest songs, especially in the 19th century. From all my research, I think that the kind of religious sentiment that fueled anti-slavery in the United States, the Second Great Awakening, it helped lead to the foundation of colonies like this around the country. There were a lot of them, and not just Swedish, there were American colonies like this. The early women's rights movement, movements for education, a lot of this was inspired by this idea that in order to make, they would have said, a Christian world, a better world, we need to act better towards other people. We need to create a common purpose in the United States around the world that binds us together rather than finds reasons to divide us into this or that. So that, it's common in those movements, and it comes into the labor movement. There were a lot of, Protestant ministers in the 1880s and 90s who got tied in with the Knights of Labor and other labor groups from that time. And as I mentioned, a lot of the songs talk about religion, specifically Jesus, the message of Jesus, and how we need to follow that. And labor is trying to do that by getting everybody unionized, better wages, living conditions, enough food to eat that. I think Joe Hill, he came out of I mentioned the Salvation Army. He went to those meetings as a kid. He listened to the songs. I think even though he's, critical of it, my personal feeling is he's still influenced by it. And he has this idea that he might mock Christianity, but part of that is because he has an idea in his head that the message of Christ is one of commonality amongst us, not division and oppression. That's how I interpret that stuff. Yeah, thank you. All right, well, I'll be around. I do have some CDs, and there's lots of liner notes on the Joe Hill CD and some songs that have never been recorded by anybody else, and some spoken word from some old hobos who claim they knew him. Got a little of that on there, but I do want to thank you. It's always a pleasure to come out here. I really like being here, and, you know, Todd says he's going to buy me a house here someday so I can move here. Because he's getting paid so much money in his job. Actually, the heat, it is warm up here. I can tell when I try to do the individual strings, it's a little difficult. But anyway, thank you so much, and I do appreciate it. Stick around.
Thank you, Bucky. That was really great. And I always learn so much. I mean, Joe Hill, what an amazing character. Again, if anybody has any questions, you can type them into the chat. If not, I've got a dozen of them. But I want to first take a moment and thank our sponsors. Thank you to the Bishop Hill Heritage Association, to the American Scandinavian Foundation, Barbara Osher Pro Suiza Foundation, Illinois Arts Council, state agency, Bill and Susan Sherrard Foundation, SWIA Chicago, and the Twin Flower Inn Bed and Breakfast. So, Bucky, there's just so much going on in the life of Joe Hill. And so I want to start with just a real basic question. What brought you to Joe Hill? How did you find or fall in love with Joe Hill?
Good question. Well, I've mentioned to you, but I haven't said it, I didn't say it on stage, I don't believe, but I grew up in a town in northern Wisconsin, a couple different towns on Lake Superior, which had a rich history connected with the history of American labor, and also with radicalism. There were a lot of iron mines up there, there were copper mines. And the Finns and the Swedes and Norwegians and East Europeans, there was a real movement up there. And one of the organizations that was involved in major strikes up there in the early 20th century was the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, which was founded in 1905 to organize all workers into a single union. And it was especially popular with some of the Scandinavians. Its radical message seemed to appeal to their social democratic or socialist tendencies. And so I knew about this stuff as a kid, but I didn't really connect it with the music. Well, then there were a couple of people who came to college in the little town I lived in Ashland, that were folk musicians. And they started I started hanging around them a little bit, and they taught me a little bit about political music. And then it turned out when I was 16, I didn't have my driver's license yet. There was a folk music festival there, right? In northern Wisconsin, the Ashland Folk Festival. And they asked me to play at the festival. I had learned a bunch of material. I was playing in a rock and roll band at the time too, but the night that I was doing my performance, I was backstage, and the only person backstage was a guy named Utah Phillips. Utah Phillips was like this legendary character in folk music circles who did all this IWW music, including the songs of Joe Hill. So I'm back there just hanging out with him, and he was a heavy drinker. He had Jack Daniels. I was 16. What could be more fun than hanging out and doing that, right? So I got interested, and then strangely enough, I went to college in a little town called Caldwell, Idaho. Caldwell, Idaho, and Idaho had been a state that had a lot of mining in the north and the silver mines, and there'd been a lot of labor conflict there. And the governor, who was anti-labor in that state, when he was out of office, somebody walked up and put a bomb on the gate of his house and opened it. When he opened it, he blew up and died. Turned out I ended up living a block from that house. So I got really interested in the whole story of how this happened. Then I ended up playing in this old bar downtown called the Saratoga, and the guy that blew him up had lived up there. So one of the bartenders took me upstairs and said, well, this is where Harry Orchard lived. And I was like, wow. So I started reading more about the IWW. I learned more about Joe Hill. And just slowly, just as I did with Woody Guthrie and many of those other songs, I incorporated those songs into my repertoire. And not surprisingly, I was sympathetic to the message. I was a young sort of hippie guy. You know, I believed we could make America better. And I thought class differences were one of the things that was wrong. And also that industrial capitalism had a little more power probably than it should in the overall scheme. So, you know, I just slowly moved into this and then, you know, started getting asked to do this. And then just to keep it short, I mean, I ended up going to graduate school in Minnesota, which was another strong center for labor and Scandinavian left tradition. So I ended up doing a PhD on the history of American labor music because that's what I wanted to do. And they said, okay, go ahead, you can do it. And,
That's
you know,
cool.
of all, you know, you were talking about trying to find a way to put together what you liked with maybe some of your more serious interests. Could you put together acting and medicine or something? I just found a way to put together my love of history and scholarship and folk music, putting them together.
That's great. It's like Joe Hill shadowed you at various stages in your life. He would be just around the corner, right above the bar, or, you know.
You're really
Well,
on
Utah
stuff.
Phillips is one of my personal heroes.
Oh, he was really an incredible guy. And then, in fact, I ended up in college when I was out there in Idaho. They gave me the job of running a little coffee house at the college, right? So who did I book? Utah Phillips.
Yeah.
And I booked my friends from Minneapolis and St. Paul and people I knew from California. So I got to meet all these people, hang around them, play music with them. And
That's great.
So Utah Phillips, I was fortunate to be able to spend quite a bit of time with him.
Well, you also mentioned Woody Guthrie, and I mentioned Woody in my introduction. And it's intriguing how even though Woody Guthrie and Joe Hill were both involved in labor movements, their musical styles are different. And what can you tell us about some of those differences and maybe some of the overlap?
Yeah. Well, you know, Joe Hill, he gets thrown into that folk category, but when you look at the music that he wrote, first of all, most of his tunes he borrowed. And he wrote some original music. There's a couple examples. He had musical training back in Sweden when he was very young, before everything went south with his family and his father died and he had to stop taking music lessons. But he could write a little bit, so he wrote some songs. But the songs that he's most influenced by, and the ones he borrows the tunes from, tend to be either religious hymns, which was common because people knew the hymns. So if you use them, you could get them to sing along right away. That's a tradition in the labor movement that predates him in Europe and the United States, but especially here. I know you've talked about the Second Great Awakening, but these hymns had a large audience. But the other thing that's so different from him, from the later group like Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, is, you know, he's going around to mining camps and lumber camps, and what's in those towns with little opera halls? What are they playing? They're not playing folk music. They're playing the latest vaudeville stuff, the newest Tin Pan Alley songs, you know what I mean? And so he borrows tunes, most often from those is the tunes that, you know, like Ta Ra Ra Boom Die, or songs like that were really popular, like when the 78s first start coming out, and vaudeville has a huge audience, and there's vaudeville clubs, you know, all over the United States. So he's hearing that stuff in the mining camps, the little opera halls, and the lumber towns as well.
So they're both promoting labor rights, but they're from different musical traditions.
Yes.
And so the way they approach it is very different.
Very different. I mean, Woody's really more anchored in, the sort of style we think of as folk music today. It's sort of the roots of bluegrass, the folk revival, country music as well grows out of it.
Yeah.
So he's got a lot of that sort of what I would call the upland South influence, which extends into Illinois as well. I mean, you have a lot of people who come from Virginia, West Virginia, and they're bringing those traditions across in Kentucky, all the way across the country in the 19th century and early 20th century. And he's one of those. That's in him, and it's in his family. I mean, his cousin, Jack Guthrie, in fact, became a very popular, he died from TB relatively young after World War II, but was definitely a country singer. And he and Woody worked together in the early years. And Jack was even in the Grand Ole Opry briefly before he died. So, Woody's got these kind of roots that are not unlike a lot of those early country musicians that we remember so well.
Well, there's one last question that I want to know.
Yeah.
And that is the origin of the song about Joe Hill and how that song has become so famous. And, a dozen folk singers, Joan Baez being my favorite version, what is the outgrowth of that song and its connection to Joe Hill?
Well, I think Joe Hill was, legendary, especially among people in labor or in social movements for social change in America, social reform. Everybody seemed to know about him. The trial was a huge national trial. I mean, the King of Sweden tried to intervene to stop the execution. President Wilson tried to stop the execution, but we won't get started on Utah politics, but they were not going to stop just because the king and the president intervened. So it was executed by firing squad, but it got so much attention around all over the world. And, all those people, including Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and everybody else after that, that was part of that folk revival. They all knew about Joe Hill. And in fact, Guthrie did write a song for Joe Hill. But there were other musicians that were part of that, not so much the folky part of it, part of the movement for social change. Pete Seeger's father was a classical musician who was involved early on in trying to get a group together similar to some of the German composers. It was music for social change, but it required more formal training. They had like worker choruses. But that tradition came into play as well. So it's really more that group that the original song comes from. But then, once you've got people like Paul Robeson singing it, then everybody is singing at that point.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you, Bucky. It's always an honor to be in your presence. I mean, you are truly a scholar and a great entertainer, and to see both of them together is what History in Person and Chautauqua is all about. And if people want to learn more about Bucky and his work, he does tour. He would love to come to your town. He's got some great CDs. I think I own most of them now. And you're heading off to the Woody Guthrie conference in
the big festival in Okima, Oklahoma. It's in July. His birthday appropriately is Bastille Day, the beginning of the French Revolution, July 14th. So I'll be down there for that weekend, like the 13th to the 17th.
So check him out online. I'm sure you can find a show and hopefully be lucky to be in the audience. And thank you all for coming out this evening and spending the evening with us. We are launching History in Person. You guys are part of the premiere event. We'll be back tomorrow night at 6 and 7. Tomorrow night, I believe it's Astrid Lindgren and no. I put the schedule together. You think I'd have it
maybe Frank.
Yes. We have Carl Sandburg and Jenny Lind tomorrow night.
That's it.
And then Astrid Lindgren and Peter Christian of Bjornsson are on Wednesday night. And since you are all pre-registered, you'll also have links in the Facebook message and in History in Person for 1 week. You can send people to see this show. It'll be up there and available on History in Person. It's YouTube /C/History in Person, but there'll be a link in the notes. And also every Tuesday from now forward, we're going to be dropping some wonderful History in Person. And we're already planning next summer, Chautauqua and Bishop Hill. August 27th and 8th are the dates. And there's a rumor, I cannot confirm, that President Herbert Hoover will be there.
Wow.
Buffalo Bill and Mark Twain and Jane Addams. And it should be a great weekend of music and stories. And that's August 27th and 8th in Bishop Hill to come to the in-person Chautauqua. Also, anytime's a good time to come to the Bishop Hill. So hopefully we'll see you there sometime soon. Thank you to our production team, Frank Blaine and Pro Video.
Thanks, Frank.
And thank you, Bucky, and thank you to all of our listeners and sponsors.